Hello, my name is Gretchen Baskerville, and for the past 20 years, I've been a Christian divorce recovery leader in evangelical churches in the Los Angeles area. I believe in the sanctity of marriage, that God meant for marriage to be lifelong, faithful, and loving. And I truly believe that some marriages can be fixed. But we need to be honest. Some marriages are horrific, and the devastation has continued for months, years, and sometimes even decades. And today I want to talk with you, my fellow Christian divorcees, and you church leaders, about something that's been on my heart for a long time. Why do our evangelical churches shoot our own wounded, our own divorcees? People who love the Lord, like you and like me. And then they treat us like second-class citizens, with the message that somehow we're to blame, that all marriage problems are just two to tango, and somehow we could have single-handedly fixed an adulterous or abusive marriage. It's as if they don't really think we were committed to the sanctity of marriage, or we didn't try very hard. Then I started asking myself, how serious is this problem? Is it just my imagination, or is it real? Is it just local, in my city, or is it widespread? And if it's real, can we measure it? So who am I, and why do I care? Well, first, I'm an evangelical who was brought up in a godly Christian home to devout parents who've been married 60 years and counting. I attend an evangelical church. I tithe, I volunteer, I serve. I've done everything from leading women's Bible studies to serving meals to our homeless neighbors and preaching the gospel in the local women's jail. I earned a Bible degree from Wheaton College. Second, 25 years ago, I needed a life-saving divorce myself. And back in 1998, I co-led my first divorce recovery group. I have learned since then that nearly half of divorces in the United States are what I call life-saving divorces. Those divorces that are due to a pattern of violence, adultery, chronic emotional abuse, sexual immorality, severe addictions, and abandonment. And I can give evidence for that claim. There are 4 key studies in my book, and if you really want to understand this topic, you need to get The Life-Saving Divorce, Hope for People Leaving Destructive Relationships. It has 220 footnotes, so you can verify the information for yourself and learn more. So why do evangelical churches shoot their own wounded, their own divorcees? We're talking about divorced people who really love the Lord, people like you and me. Well, it's interesting. Many church leaders and marriage book authors and Christian radio programs treat us as second-class citizens. They imply that somehow we were quitters who took the easy way out by getting divorced, that somehow we couldn't go the distance in marriage like everyone else could. This is grossly unfair to many of us. So how widespread is this problem of stigmatizing divorcees? Is it mainly an evangelical problem? And how many godly divorcees leave the church? Can we even measure it? So I want to show you some slides. First, a fascinating article from Christianity Today answered my question back in February 2020. The headline was, "Despite Stigma, more divorced evangelicals are going to church." And as a committed Christian, I think that's great news. In terms of numbers, a lot of divorced Christians, mainly evangelicals, attend church nearly every week or more. But can we measure what percentage of divorced evangelicals might be missing and don't attend evangelical churches? Where is the attendance gap? Here is the graph that was at the bottom of the article in my last slide. If you look at this graph, it shows church attendance by religious tradition and marital status. So it's showing us what percentage of evangelicals, mainline Protestants, Black Protestants, and Catholics attend church nearly weekly or more. The blue dashed line is the percentage of married people who attend church. The orange line is the percentage of divorced or separated people who attend church. Now, this is a fascinating graph, and we could discuss a variety of topics based on these figures. But today, we're focused on the 4 blue ovals. The ovals demonstrate the 2018 attendance gaps for Christians. The gaps highlight the proportion of divorcees versus the proportion of marrieds that are attending. I'm not talking about numbers, I'm talking about ratios, percentages of all married evangelicals and percentage of all divorced evangelicals who attend church often. To simplify this, we'll say a big oval is bad and a little oval is good. And like I said, I realize I'm oversimplifying this, so stay with me. The big gap shown by the big blue oval in the upper left rectangle indicates that a high proportion of married evangelicals attend evangelical churches, but a much lower proportion of evangelical divorcees attend. Compare that to the smaller blue ovals, which you'll see in the mainline Protestant, the Black Protestant, and Catholic groups. Small ovals mean that a similar proportion of their marrieds and their divorcees attend. For the purpose of this discussion, we'll just say that the smaller the oval, the more comfortable that divorcees feel in attending that church. So what I'm trying to point out is this big gap, that big blue oval in the upper left, the evangelicals. It shows that we would normally expect a lot more evangelical divorcees to attend than actually do. Bottom line, evangelical churches aren't doing a good job with evangelical divorcees. In my opinion, a higher percentage of evangelical divorcees feel stigmatized and unwelcome here. What makes them feel unwelcome? Well, as I've already mentioned, researchers know that about half of divorces are for very serious problems, a pattern of adultery, sexual immorality, domestic violence, mental abuse, addictions, criminal behavior such as pedophilia, etc. Yet many evangelical pastors preach divorce-bashing sermons from the pulpit and create a climate in the church that sees all divorcees the same way. To be fair, sometimes they are gentler to those of us who are married to adulterers. But in churches where physical or emotional abuse is not seen as biblical grounds for divorce, many dear divorced Christians are rejected. One Lifeway research study showed that 3 in 4 Protestant pastors say yes, that physical abuse is an acceptable reason for divorce. Yet we know that the majority of evangelical pastors say no to emotional, verbal, or mental abuse. Now let's talk about some examples of stigmatizing statements. How about this? And by the way, both of these are real statements from Sunday sermons at a megachurch. Number 1, if you walk away from your marriage, you're walking away from Jesus. The implication is that you'll lose your salvation if you divorce. This statement makes no distinction between godly spouses and destructive ones. And if true, that walking away from your marriage equals walking away from God, then divorce becomes the unpardonable sin. One of the women in my divorce recovery groups heard this sermon and called me that afternoon, and I listened to the sermon online later. In the sermon, she said, the pastor repeated this phrase 5 times with no explanations, no caveats. If I hadn't been going to one of your divorce recovery groups, I'd be lying on the floor, curled up in fetal position, sucking my thumb. Thank you for telling me this isn't true. Now let's look at the second sermon. Different pastor this time. Divorce never makes anything better. It just gives you different problems. This statement implies that divorcees are brainless, clueless people who haven't calculated the cost of hiring attorneys and dividing the assets, not to mention arguing over child custody and spousal support. It assumes that neither parent has ever considered the effect of divorce on their children. To be honest, I find this statement really insulting. Most good parents are extremely worried about their children. Further, it suggests that this pastor has counted the costs and is well informed on the latest studies on divorce and outcomes, which I seriously doubt, or he wouldn't be making such claims. Now let's look at some of these claims, these messages we hear at church. In my book, I call these the 27 myths of divorce, and I go into a lot of details on each one. While these messages indeed may be true for immature people, people who miss the party life, people who are just sort of bored with their marriage, they are not true for committed Christians who sacrificed and invested over and over to save their marriage. Let's look at these messages. You didn't try hard enough. Oh, yes, we did. You didn't value the sanctity of marriage. Of course we did, or we wouldn't have gone back into a toxic situation, risking our well-being over and over. You didn't have the dedication to make marriage work like the rest of us. Well, I would say in reply, that's quite an assumption. You don't know what's happening behind closed doors, and you probably don't know that many Christian spouses will keep the bad stuff hidden, and they will fall on their swords to protect their own reputation and their children's. You don't know how much time and effort went into saving that marriage. You didn't obey Jesus' teaching about forgiveness. Oh, no, we forgave 70 times 7. We went the extra mile over and over. We reconciled many times, far more than anyone else knows. Divorce is the unpardonable sin. No, sorry, the Bible shows that God allows life-saving divorces. It takes two to tango, or all marriage problems are 50-50. No, some spouses have severe character problems, and they're very destructive. Well, you're not perfect either. Well, frankly, nobody's perfect. Are only perfect people allowed to point out sin and get themselves to safety? If that's the case, it's amazing our justice system works at all. You didn't give him enough sex. Well, ask anyone who divorced a serial cheater or child molester. No matter how much enthusiastic sex you gave, it didn't stop them. And academically, there are no studies showing that giving more sex to a porn addict or to a serial adulterer fixes it. Your kids will be destroyed if you divorce. Well, that's not necessarily true either, and let me take a little extra time on this one. First, researchers have reported since the mid-1980s that nearly 8 in 10 kids turn out just fine with no serious long-term emotional, psychological, or social problems after the divorce. And for more than 20 years, researchers have known that marriages where there's abuse or very high distress are terrible for children. In these cases, staying is 10 times worse for kids than leaving. But to be fair, in marriages where there is no tension, no abuse, no fear, no betrayal, or even in a marriage where there might have been some in the past, but it's been resolved and fixed, it is best to stay for the kids. The rule of thumb is this: in bad marriages, divorce is good for kids. In good or so-so marriages, divorce is bad for kids. Your marriage would be healed if you just prayed more. This one sort of makes me laugh. Most of us prayed and fasted and begged God for years to fix our marriages. Many of us have stacks of journals where we wrote entry after entry, day after day, agonizing over our marriages and telling ourselves that God will finally fix it someday. But we realize that God doesn't force people to behave well. And sometimes He answers our prayer by giving us the courage to leave. It's God's will for you to suffer quietly in your marriage. No, it's not. Jesus doesn't want you to be abused and betrayed and battered to bring Him glory. Divorce shatters the image of Christ and the church. How is that even possible? Nothing can destroy the image of Christ in the church. And if divorce shatters the image of Christ in the church, doesn't treachery such as infidelity and abuse and pedophilia shatter it even more? Marriage is God's best way to mature you. Frankly, I don't know of any study that says that. Marriage is just one way that God uses to mature us. But God can use singleness, our job, our platoon leader, our setbacks, our co-workers, our children, our sick relatives to mature us. People who divorce just bring their problems with them and will just have another bad marriage. While this may be true for immature people, it is often not true for the invested spouse who's endured a 10, 20, 30-year destructive marriage. And most of them have higher well-being, whether they remarry or decide to stay single after divorce. And these divorcees have happier remarriages. But regardless of length of marriage, researchers have found that 7 in 10 Christian divorcees say they are happy after divorce. Only 3 in 10 are not. If you stay, you just might save your spouse. No, in 1 Corinthians 7, the Apostle Paul says that you shouldn't count on being able to save your spouse. No begging, no chasing after them. Let them go. You can't divorce because your spouse had a bad childhood. They can't help themselves. They don't know any better. Well, just because they don't realize what they're doing, and that maybe they aren't intentionally being destructive, doesn't mean you can't get away to safety. We were told that our love would fix that empty hole in their heart, but it didn't. Our love and support didn't change them. In fact, we needed to exercise our God-given sense of self-preservation to get to a safe place and get away from an abuser, no matter what their motivation. So, who promotes these myths? I would suggest 3 different types of people and organizations do. Number 1, well-meaning but ill-informed pastors and church leaders who treat divorcees as losers and make our church fellowships unsafe for us. 2, some Christian marriage authors who pretend that a pattern of abuse or adultery would be easy to fix by being more agreeable, praying more, having more sex, or learning new communication skills. They will tell you God will fix your marriage, but in reality, miracles are few and far between. That's why they're called miracles. And the damage done to kids and the abuse victim in the meantime is far worse than divorce itself. Third, finally, there are marriage at any cost organizations, both secular and religious, that pretend to be fair and unbiased researchers. They may even have PhD level people on staff. They show graphs and studies, and they likely have the word institute or research or studies in their name. Their agenda is very interesting. It seems to be 1, to describe marriage as the only reliable path to a good life and a miracle cure for all of society's ills. I guess I'm exaggerating a little bit, but you get what I'm saying. 2, blaming people's bad behavior or low functioning on divorce or on not getting married in the first place. They don't look at a person's character at all. 3, downplaying the prevalence of mental abuse, adultery, sexual immorality, domestic violence, addictions, and abandonment in U.S. society. 4, ignoring the years of studies showing that kids experience severe damage by being in abusive, tense, or scary homes. In some cases, 10 times more damage than those kids whose parents divorced. There were big studies in the 1980s, 1990s, and 2000s. 5, presenting data in a way that appears to support their cause, even when it actually doesn't. So let me give you a funny example of one of these studies from a marriage at any cost organization. Here's an example of presenting data in such a way that it stigmatizes divorcees and their kids. Look at this graph and I'll explain it all to you. This is a graph of school students who have ever been suspended or expelled by family type. The blue line is two-parent birth families, and the pink line is separated or divorced moms. If you look down at the green line, that's kids brought up by their birth dad alone. So these dads and moms are at about the same level for likelihood of having a child with major behavior problems. In the article that contained this graph, the organization makes a big deal about how kids from these homes are 60% more likely to have problems at school. 60%! That's a huge number. That sounds scary, and this graph looks scary. But look at the scale on the graph. It only goes up to 16%. It's zoomed in. What if we saw this graph more realistically, say at 100%, not at 16%? Well, here we go. This is how it looks at 100%. Wow, hardly any kids from any type of home get expelled or suspended from school. It's not so scary after all. Only 5 in 100 kids from two-parent families, and only 8 in 100 kids from separated or divorced families. There's nothing wrong with the actual numbers themselves. They're from a large national survey. But the way they've been presented is sneaky, and the way they've been interpreted is manipulative. So don't let marriage at any cost organizations mislead you by how they present the information. Now let's talk about how to identify a safe church. Number 1. A safe church listens to the painful stories from devout Christians who had to divorce. They listen for an hour if need be. They show empathy. They gasp at the appropriate moments, and they don't ask questions until the end, if at all. Number 2, a safe church has leaders who change the narrative around divorce and mention in staff meetings and in sermons that half of divorces are for life-saving reasons. They retrain the kids' ministry workers too to stop giving false messages about divorce and divorcees and their kids, and to stop treating kids of divorce like they're doomed to failure. Number 3, a safe church has a divorce recovery group that does not shame people for getting life-saving divorces. It connects people to others who have walked in their shoes and can give them hope that there's life after divorce. Number 4, leaders at a safe church tell women and men from the pulpit that they should not put up with abuse or infidelity. Sure, Jesus calls us to forgive. But if it's a pattern of marriage-endangering sin, we also need to teach that you can forgive and get a divorce. It's not enough to tell the misbehaving spouse to fly right. You must empower the invested spouse to speak up. And number 5, a safe church has their divorce policy posted publicly online so that people can decide whether this is a safe church for them. My divorce group always had stowaways, God-fearing spouses from other churches who couldn't find support at their own church. Now let me end with a blessing for you. May the Lord bless you and your children. May you hold your head high without shame for taking the steps to protect yourself and your kids. May you grow closer to the Lord who loves you and will never forsake you. May you know deep in your soul that God really loves you, truly. May you sense that His love is not limited to a church building, and His Holy Spirit is with you now, defending you from Satan the accuser. You are loved and treasured, and nothing can separate you from the love of Christ. Amen. I have a set of tips on how to end the stigma of divorce in your church. If you'd like to download a free copy of these tips, just sign up for my email list. You'll receive a confirmation email that contains a link to download this free tip sheet. Go to lifesavingdivorce.com/courage. Again, that's lifesavingdivorce.com/courage.